Hey guys, tonight, we're wading into the soggy, slippery, and surprisingly elegant world of Victorian seaweed collecting. Picture this. It's a blustery morning somewhere along the British coast in 1865. The tide's just gone out, leaving behind a shimmering sheen of brine shells and ribbon-like seaweed dancing in rock pools. And there you are. Yes, you wearing a corset, a dozen petticoats, a bonnet that could catch wind like a ship's sail, and dainty lace-up boots that are already soaked through. You crouch delicately near a tide pool, holding a parasol in one hand and a dripping mass of algae in the other, because this is exactly what a proper Victorian lady does on her day off. You probably won't survive this, by the way. The hem of your dress alone weighs 20 pounds when wet, and there's a strong possibility a crab has scuttled inside one of your shoes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've left the bustle of the parlor behind and come down to the shore. You step out past the seawall where the brine hits your nose and your boots make that gentle squelch on the wet pebbles. You're not alone. Dozens of women in full dress complete with gloves, veils, and beaded chatelaines are wandering around, crouching in the surf, carefully plucking bits of slimy greenery off rocks. This, my friend, is not a fever dream. It's peak 19th century fashion seaweed art. And you're here for it. You tiptoe through the wet sand, lifting your skirts delicately, holding your notebook in one hand and a little jar in the other. If you're lucky, you'll find a piece of Irish moss, or maybe a sprig of sea lettuce, the kind that presses well. There are no smartphones, no social media. Instead, you're chasing beauty that grows in the ebb of the tide. Seaweed collecting is not just a pastime. It's a whole vibe. A slippery, slightly smelly, scientific but socially acceptable form of seaside leisure that has you risking your modesty, your balance, and occasionally your dignity. Historians still argue whether this obsession was more about science or status, but one thing is clear. Victorian women turned an ordinary patch of algae into a social ritual, wrapped in linen and lace. Imagine you bend down carefully, teasing a crimson frond from a rock, tucking it into a notebook, already filled with pressed sea plants, scribbled notes, and probably a doodle of the gentleman who sells lemonade near the pier. You're performing a quiet act of rebellion, because in a time when women were discouraged from intellectual pursuits, seaweed collecting gave you a rare chance to combine leisure art and amateur science, all while appearing perfectly ladylike. You spot another lady a few paces away. She lifts her skirts higher than is strictly polite to avoid a puddle. She's balancing a jar of brine and what looks suspiciously like a strand of kelp that's way too long to fit in her scrapbook. She smiles at you conspiratorial. There's a kinship in shared, soggy pursuits. Your boots are soaked through. A wave just sneaks up on your ankles, and now your petticoat smells like salt and sea cabbage. You don't care. You are an algae enthusiast now. You adjust your bonnet, pull your shawl tighter, and march on towards the next rock pool, the next frond, the next weird little thing to press flat and admire. Somewhere behind you, a man from the Natural History Society is staring, baffled. Are all these women actually doing taxonomy in petticoats with ribboned parasols and pearl-tipped tweezers? Yes? Yes, they are. And you, dear listener, are now part of that odd, glorious, squelchy movement. Congratulations! Your damp, seaweed-filled scrapbook is about to become a cultural artifact. Your notebook is already damp, the ink on the first few pages smudged from salty fingers, and the occasional wayward splash. Still, you flip to a clean sheet, and carefully place your most recent find, a delicate fan-shaped red algae, between two thin pages. You'll press it later at home, under a heavy book of sermons you've never actually read. This isn't just a whim or a beachside lark. It's part of a full-blown Victorian Seaweed album craze. Yes, really. You might not believe it now as you awkwardly balance on a slick rock in boots never designed for such things. But Seaweed albums were once considered the height of fashionable naturalism. You glance around and realize you're not the only one with a scrapbook. In fact, every woman out here has one. Some are bound in leather, some are wrapped in cloth with floral embroidery. All are filled with pressed seaweed samples, each one carefully dried, labeled with scientific names, or close enough and artfully arranged like delicate underwater bouquets. It's not just about collecting, it's about presentation. You crouch to pick up a golden strand of corda phylum, often called dead man's ropes. The name is horrifying. The seaweed gorgeous. Long, thin like a lock of silky hair. You coil it gently into a spiral, imagining how it will look next to the deep green frond you found earlier. You consider adding a haiku to the page. Why not? It's 1872, and you're a little bit artsy. This entire seaweed frenzy didn't happen overnight. It started innocently enough, a few seaside walks, a few ladies jotting down sketches, and suddenly, scrapbooking mania. Queen Victoria's own daughters collected seaweed, which made it fashionable overnight. If royalty could go elbow-deep in rock pools, so could you. Historians still argue whether the seaweed album craze began as a feminine counterpart to the gentlemen's scientific societies, or whether it simply spiraled from a general Victorian obsession with cataloging everything. Plants, insects, bird feathers, spiritual awakenings, you name it. If it could be pasted, pressed, or pinned, the Victorians were there for it. There were even competitions. Not formal ones, of course. But every tea circle had at least one woman who was known for her impeccable frond placement or her astonishingly symmetrical red algae arrangements. You knew if you brought your album to the local ladies' circle, it had better be tidy, artistic, and at least lightly educational. Bonus points if you knew the Latin. And if you didn't, well, there was always embroidery. But you're committed. You take the time to clean each piece, rinse it in brine, and gently spread it out in your notebook using the tip of your glove. The fronds stick to the page like ink drawings. When they dry, they'll become permanent, quiet, preserved whispers of your afternoon by the sea. As you stand up and brush the sand off your skirt, a breeze catches the corner of your album. It flips open to a page you finished last week, a small green seaweed, arranged like a wreath with tiny red threads at the center. You added a ribbon to the edge of the paper just because. That page got compliments at the last tea gathering. Mrs. Pevensey said it was positively botanical. You beamed for hours. Today you're hoping for something bolder, something rare. You heard a rumor someone found a fragment of Desmarestia viridis last week, the infamous sea sorrel acidic when dry. She used tongs to handle it and wore her husband's gardening gloves. You admire that level of commitment. You walk further along the beach skirt, lifting gently in the sea breeze. You pass another woman who is staring at a rock with the focus of a scientist and the expression of someone who dropped her lunch into the tide pool. You offer a polite nod. She nods back. Neither of you speaks. This is a ritual, after all. The tide begins to creep back in. You hurry your pace, knowing you have maybe an hour left before the good rocks are submerged. The sea glimmers like glass in the distance. Somewhere behind the dunes, someone's dog is barking. Nearby, the splash of a gull diving headlong into the surf makes you flinch and nearly drop your notebook. The seaweed in your hand is a reddish-brown fan. You don't know its name, not yet. But it curls slightly at the edges like it's blushing. It's going in the center of the next page. Maybe with a quote, you're thinking Shakespeare, or something French. Whatever makes Mrs. Pevensey raise an eyebrow. Seaweed collecting, you realize, is not about the seaweed. Not really. It's about what you turn it into. Beauty, bragging rights, a secret scientific record, a souvenir that smells faintly of salt and damp paper. And it's about the feeling you get when you find a perfect specimen just sitting there, waiting to be noticed. Just like you. The thing about seaweed collecting is it wasn't just about algae and aesthetics. It was a socially acceptable excuse to wander, think, and whisper it, be alone. In an age when every woman's role was clearly defined by domesticity and decorum, you in your ankle-soaked boots and windswept curls are indulging in something deliciously different, a solo mission for something no one else quite understands. That's part of the appeal. You crouch again, poking at a frond half buried in sand. The cold water seeps into your glove, but you don't flinch. It's a small price to pay for the thrill of discovery. Besides, you're a Victorian lady, which means you've been trained from birth to smile through discomfort. Corsets, remember. At home, your family thinks you're simply enjoying fresh air. But you know better. This is a hobby, yes, but also a quiet assertion of intellectual autonomy. It's not knitting. It's not embroidering tiny ducks on doilies. It's not smiling politely at tea while someone explains to you how train engines work. It's your thing. You think of your friend Clarissa, who once tried to bring her Seaweed album to a dinner party, and was informed gently that dinner parties were for conversation, not chlorophyta. She never brought it up again. But the day after, she returned to the coast with twice the jars and a notebook full of Latin labels scribbled in hurried pencil. Respect. Historians still argue whether Victorian women truly owned these scientific hobbies, or whether they were simply given limited playgrounds to mimic the work of men. But one thing is clear, within that constrained space, women like you built entire quiet empires of knowledge. You pause to gaze out at the shoreline. Seagulls wheel overhead like they're debating the ethics of art collecting. A child shrieks somewhere in the distance, probably reacting to a crab. You smile mostly because you stepped on the same kind of crab earlier and managed not to scream. You're nothing if not composed. There's something poetic about all this gathering fragments of sea life, smoothing them down, preserving them in pages. It reminds you of poetry itself, rhythm, movement, delicacy. Even now, as you crouch again and gently peel a thread of ceramium rubrum off a stone, you can't help but imagine how it might curl on the page beside a few words in elegant ink. Seaweed collecting might be ladylike, but it also requires grit. It demands precision balance and a stomach for smells that can only be described as medicinal with hints of fish funeral. You've ruined more gloves than you can count. Your last hair ribbon fell into a tide pool and was claimed by what you're certain was an eel. You didn't scream then either. See grit. Every woman on this beach is playing a part. Proper bonnets, dignified posture, embroidered parasols. But underneath it all, they're scheming. They're thinking about angles, page layout, pigment retention. One woman is debating whether two overlapping fronds look too much like antlers. Another is softly muttering Latin to herself while wringing out a ribbon of green. You respect her instantly, and as for you, you're planning your next page like a general planning battle. You want symmetry, but not stiffness. Whimsy, but within bounds. You want to suggest knowledge without boasting about it. Because nothing says Victorian sophistication like pretending you accidentally created a botanical masterpiece. You stand and squint at the sun. It's probably been an hour, but it's hard to tell time without clocks or notifications. The tide is beginning to change again, rolling in with a soft, hushing noise that feels almost conspiratorial. Like the ocean is telling you better wrap it up before I take your boots. You look down at your haul, 6 new samples each resting in briny water, inside little glass jars wrapped in lace napkins. They smell like the world's worst salad. But in a few days, pressed, dried, arranged, they'll look like magic. And when you show them to your friends, you'll pretend it was all effortless. Oh, that frond! It just floated into my hand. The Latin. Something I picked up between embroidery lessons and fainting from emotional repression. Even if they don't get it, even if they raise an eyebrow or call it a seasonal phase, you'll know better. This is your expression, your identity hidden in algae. And while the rest of society writes you off as a woman with a little too much free time, your scrapbook is quietly cataloging a world they'll never see. The wind shifts. You wrap your shawl tighter, one hand still damp from a pool, the other cradling your notebook like it's a diary, a canvas and a secret laboratory all at once. Welcome to the weird windswept art of being an amateur naturalist. Or as your mother would say, playing with slime and calling it science. By now your fingertips are permanently wrinkled, and your boots make that wet schluck sound with every step. But you don't mind. You've entered what can only be described as the algal flow state, a trance of squinting at tide pools gently peeling seaweed from rocks, and occasionally whispering, "Ooh, you'll look lovely next to the bladder rack." It's here in this rhythmic back and forth with the tide that you begin to understand seaweed isn't just decoration. It's science, albeit wrapped in ribbons. Victorian women like yourself were not just pressing seaweed for keepsake albums, they were engaging in a quiet form of amateur marine biology. You may not have formal training, but you know the difference between fucus vesiculosus and ulva lactica. You rinse, label, arrange. Some women even measured pH with strips of cabbage paper not required, but very committed. You pass another collector who's sitting cross-legged on a towel, sketching a particularly curly specimen in her field journal. Her bonnet's a little askew, and she has ink on her nose. You like her instantly. Back then, women were largely excluded from official scientific societies. But seaweed, mild, quiet, unassuming seaweed, gave them a loophole. It was nature study, a feminine version of science, as long as you stayed in your lane and didn't start using phrases like specimen yield variance at dinner. Historians still argue whether Victorian seaweed collectors were genuine contributors to science or merely decorative dilettantes. But let's be honest, if you're crawling around on cold rocks in a corset and documenting marine life while everyone else is sipping tea indoors, you deserve at least an honorary degree. You crouch again, your skirt puffing like a collapsing souffle. This time, you find something marvelous, a lacy, almost translucent frond the size of your hand, with faint red edges and a gentle curve like a painter's brushstroke. You've never seen one like it. It shimmers in the light, still wet, and seems to hum with possibility. You whisper a little gotcha, and slip it into your jar with the reverence of someone handling an antique lace doily. It might be Deliceria sanguinea, though you're not totally sure. You'll look it up later in that reference book. Clarissa lent you the one with the spine that creaks like an old captain's knees. The ocean laps at your ankles again. A salty breeze ruffles your sleeve. You pause and breathe it in iodine brine and faint traces of rotting sea lettuce. Ah, nature. The act of collecting seaweed is oddly intimate. You're handling something that lived only moments ago brushing the skin of the sea. And now, because you admired its shape, it will dry between pages and become something new, a specimen, an art piece, a memory. Perhaps even a contribution to science, if not yours, then someone else's years down the line, flipping through a dusty album in a museum drawer. You remember a story, half fact, half seaside gossip of a young woman whose album of pressed seaweed ended up in the hands of a famous marine botanist. He admired her arrangement, her accuracy, even her spelling. her name unknown. The album attributed simply to Anonymous Lady 1883. And isn't that the Victorian way, quiet contributions, unsigned masterpieces, scientific footnotes written in invisible ink? Your frond shimmers again in the sunlight. You wonder if it's more than just beautiful, if perhaps it's rare or newly identified. The idea tickles you, not out of ego, but possibility. Maybe someone centuries from now will peer at this exact sample held safe between yellowed paper and wonder who first found it. It was you. Soaked to the ankles, slightly wind-burned, and grinning like a lunatic over a piece of sea spaghetti. The tide is creeping in faster now. You begin to backtrack along the shore eyes, still scanning for treasure. This walk is half scavenger hunt, half meditation. You move slower, savoring the textures, the squelch of sand, the slap of water, the faint tug of seaweed against your gloves. You are in sync with the sea now, your thoughts drifting like algae in the surf. As you reach a rocky outcrop near the pier, you find a hidden little pool, sheltered, shaded, undisturbed. You crouch again, your knees no longer protest, they've accepted their fate. And there, nestled beside a pebble, is a tiny cluster of fronds, so intricate they resemble a miniature tree. You hesitate. Do you pluck it? Do you document it? Or do you leave it for the next careful soul who squelches by? In the end, you take a sketch. Carefully, quietly. A scientific souvenir and a gesture of respect. Because in the world of Victorian seaweed, collecting, not everything beautiful needs to be moved. You stretch your back with a gentle groan, the kind that only a corset-wearing naturalist knows the sound of bones protesting both the damp and your artistic ambition. The wind picks up slightly now, brushing sea spray across your cheeks like an exfoliant made by Poseidon himself. And still you carry on. Because this isn't a spa day, it's a full-bodied commitment to aesthetic marine science Victorian style. You glance down at your gloves. They're soaked, and not just from water. You tried to remove a stubborn bit of sea moss earlier and ended up elbow-deep in what can only be described as ocean slime. You're not even mad. It's part of the experience. And anyway, Victorian women were masters of discomfort. Society expected you to sit for hours in stiff parlors without slouching, to wear 17 layers of fabric in the summer, and to smile while doing it. By comparison, ankle-deep in tide pools feels positively liberating. You're not being watched here. Well, except by the occasional curious gull. A woman nearby lets out a soft yelp. She's slipped slightly one boot, now lodged firmly in a puddle. She giggles and waves it off like nothing happened. You smile. There's a strange unspoken solidarity among women engaged in delicate hobbies that require physical inconvenience. Historians still argue whether seaweed collecting was a kind of proto-feminist act or just an extension of Victorian domestic virtue projected onto rocks. But when you see women risking twisted ankles for algae spirals, the line starts to blur. There's something ceremonial about this kind of discomfort. You endure the wind, the soggy hems, the seawater freckles on your spectacles, not just for the collection, but for the quiet satisfaction of doing something completely your own. Besides, back home in the parlor, you'll have a story to tell. Well, a story you'll tell softly, with a half smile, over a cup of lavender tea. Perhaps something like, "Oh yes, I was out at the cove, found a lovely piece of plocamium, nearly lost a shoe, but quite worth it." You trudge a bit further down the shoreline, now boots suctioning against soft, wet sand. The rocks are slipperier here, but that's also where the rarer specimens hide. That's always the case. Beauty, it seems, prefers inconvenient places. You pass a woman carefully balancing on a rock. She's holding a small mirror under a seaweed strand to study its underside, without disturbing it. Genius, also highly unstable. You give her a nod, silently communicating your admiration and concern. Nearby, a mother and daughter gather together, the little girl pointing excitedly at a particularly shiny patch of sea lettuce. Her mother leans down, scoops it gently, and slips it into a jar. You wonder how long they've been doing this together. How many seaweed albums have been made by pairs of hands generations apart? This is not just about the algae. This is about tradition and inheritance, and the strange way love hides in quiet rituals. Back in your bag, your seaweed journal is starting to fatten. The pages have swelled slightly from humidity, the bindings are tinged with salt. It's a thing of beauty now. A bit worn, a bit wobbly, but that only makes it more authentic. Like you, it's been to the sea and returned softer. You sit down on a flat rock to rest. The wind rustles your skirts, your boots finally stop squishing. You take a moment to just breathe, in and out. Salty, clean air. The kind that scrubs the inside of your mind. This is what they don't tell you in etiquette books. That real calm doesn't come from needlepoint or tea or polite applause. It comes from wading into the ocean's edge with soggy gloves and zero apologies. The waves roll gently now, lapping at the rocks with that familiar hush-hush, like the ocean is sharing gossip with the earth. You close your eyes for a moment and let it wash over you. The cold, the quiet, the weird sense of peace that only comes when you're thoroughly damp and genuinely unbothered. When you open your eyes, the sun has begun its descent. You take one last look at the tide pools, your kingdom of puddles and slippery glory, and rise, notebook in hand. Time to head back. And as you walk, you do so with soggy feet, messy hair, and the quiet pride of someone who spent her afternoon collecting seaweed and came away with a little more than she started with. You finally reach the edge of the path, the dividing line between the dignified promenade and the messy, salt-crusted world of tide pools you've just left behind. Passers-by glance your way, some with curiosity, others with the polite confusion of people who've never seen a lady carrying what appears to be a basket of ocean spaghetti. Let them stare. They don't know you've just spent the last 2 hours practicing the gentle art of collection. Part meditation, part scavenger hunt, and wholly satisfying. As you settle onto a dry bench under a swaying parasol, you open your satchel and begin inspecting your finds. And here comes the fun part, the tools of the trade. If you thought a lady's reticule was mysterious before, wait until you peek inside a seaweed collector's kit. You take out your folding drying board covered in muslin stretched taut. It's held together with tiny wooden pegs and has the faint, sour scent of vinegar, necessary to prevent your specimens from wilting into indistinct slime. Next, your glass jar of brine, because fresh water would ruin the shape of many marine plants. The algae in your jar floats delicately like the ghost of a salad. Your notebook lies open beside you, pages already softened by mist and sea air. And of course your tweezers, not the dainty cosmetic ones, but long curved brass ones, like something out of a surgeon's drawer. Perfect for teasing apart delicate fronds without tearing them. There's also a blotter cloth, a wax pencil, and because you're extra fancy today, a ribbon-trimmed magnifying glass tucked into a silk pouch. For when you want to admire the cellular structure of a particularly feathery green algae without getting sand in your eyelashes. Victorian ladies didn't mess around with their accessories. Even if society didn't let you into universities, it at least permitted you to dress the part of a seaweed scientist, as long as everything came with lace. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of delicate accessories helped normalize seaweed collection as a feminine science, or simply added flair to an already peculiar trend. Either way, you're grateful. Because, let's be honest, tongs with velvet handles are just better. A group of men in straw hats stroll past behind you debating fish prices and tide charts. One of them pauses, looks at your setup, and arches an eyebrow. You meet his glance without a word, like a salty scholar of the shore. He doesn't ask. Smart man. There's a beautiful contrast in your current moment, the softness of lace gloves handling a crinkled red algae, the elegance of calligraphy labeling a sample that smells vaguely like foot. This whole practice lives in the intersection of refinement and rot. And you love it. You start arranging today's finds onto your drying board, carefully spreading the fronds with a soft, bristled brush. There's ulva in pale green sheets like sea glass turned leaf. There's a strand of sargassum that curls naturally into a spiral, and a particularly plump specimen that may or may not be decomposing, but adds a certain rustic charm. You write tiny notes next to each one, where it was found, the tide level, your personal impressions. You toy with a haiku about one particularly stubborn strand. Brine on my fingers, algae curls like ribboned hair, tide steals back my boot. You chuckle softly to yourself. You are a woman of the sea, and this is your poetry now. There's a light tap on your shoulder. It's Clarissa. Her hat tilted her face rosy from sea breeze. She's holding her own basket, equally chaotic, and says with absolute seriousness, I found something that looks like lettuce, but it moved. So I threw it back. You both collapse into gentle laughter. Another shared ritual among seaweed collectors, the daily mystery specimen. Always wet, always questionable, always remembered. Clarissa peeks at your notebook and gasps at the spiraled frond. You're going to win the next album night, she whispers, half teasing, half serious. You pretend to protest. It's not a competition. But it is. And you're in it to win. Together you sit in the shade, the ocean sighing behind you, sorting through the day's findings, like Victorian pirates dividing loot. Except instead of gold, it's barnacled stems and delicate sea lettuce. And instead of rum, it's strong black tea from a thermos that tastes faintly of last week's sardine sandwich. The sun has begun to lower itself toward the horizon. The light now casts everything in golden halos, even the salt on your boots. And you realize this isn't just about algae or art or science. It's about taking space, claiming a bit of the natural world for yourself, and transforming it into something personal. Something pressed, dried, named, and remembered. Later that evening, you sit cross-legged on the floor of your parlor, the hem of your skirt carefully tucked under so it won't wrinkle. Your boots are drying by the hearth. You've lit a candle not for light, but for ambience. And spread out before you are your pages, jars, brushes, and a modest but growing sense of victory. Because here's the truth you wouldn't dare say aloud at dinner: you might be a botanist. Not officially, of course. There are no letters after your name, no position in a gentleman's society. But you've spent your day collecting, classifying, documenting. You're not just picking pretty things, you're making sense of the sea's chaos. And you're not alone. Across drawing rooms and parlors all over Britain, women just like you are assembling seaweed albums. Not scrapbooks, not decorations, but visual handwritten records of the living ocean. Each page tells a story: when it was found, what it looked like when wet, what the weather was doing, what sort of mood you were in. Seaweed becomes the medium, but the real subject, you. You gently lift a fresh specimen from its briny jar using your long tweezers. It flops like wet ribbon. You pat it dry with muslin and gently arrange it on a fresh page. The fronds splay outward like a fan, delicate and vaguely ridiculous. You press it down with blotting paper, coaxing it into place with a brush. The ends curl, but you don't mind. Imperfection gives it character. A final dab with the corner of a handkerchief, and it's ready to dry. This is your process, not a whim, a practice. Historians still argue whether these albums count as scientific contributions. Some say the women behind them lacked formal taxonomy skills. Others argue the albums offer priceless insight into marine biodiversity, especially in areas and eras where no official records exist. You don't need them to decide. You know what it means to spend 2 hours ankle-deep in salt water teasing slippery ribbons of life off cold rocks. That effort doesn't disappear just because it was done in a skirt. As your page dries under a small stack of books, including On the Origin of Species, which you've read exactly half of you flip through your earlier work. There's the page from last summer's trip to Cornwall deep green ulva, next to a page of brown laminaria, arranged like a flowing mustache. You were feeling whimsical that day, and it shows. Then there's the pressed cluster from your rainy walk with Clarissa red as a crushed plum, its edges still sharp. You remember her shriek when the tide surprised her, and how you both laughed until your bonnets were soaked. Each sample holds more than algae. It holds context, emotion, weather, company, sometimes even secrets. And while society may see seaweed collecting as a passing hobby for ladies with too many afternoons and not enough embroidery, you see it differently. You see it as the one place where curiosity is not only allowed, it's required. You look around your parlor, and for the first time today, you notice how much of it has been shaped by this passion. The faint smell of salt still clings to your gloves. Your drying board leans against the wall like a piece of strange folk art. And on the mantel, a framed album page, your personal favorite, sits proudly next to the family portrait. Quiet defiance. Across the room, the cat yawns, unimpressed. You take it as encouragement. You reach for your journal and begin to write. Found a long, reddish filament near the pier, looked like sea spaghetti. Possibly Desmorestia. Clarissa stepped on it. Moment was profound. You laugh softly, pleased with yourself. These aren't just notes. They're observations, the first step in any scientific method, whether the world recognizes it or not. And just then, something catches your eye. A letter unopened sits on the table. You remember now it arrived this morning, but you were already packing your seaside kit. It's from your cousin Beatrice, the one in Wales. She sent 3 pressed samples of seaweed from a beach near Aberystwyth, along with a short note. Darling, I hope these add color to your collection. One smells rather fishy. You're welcome. Love, B. You grin. There's something unspoken but powerful in the act of sending someone a flattened bit of algae in the post. It's friendship, scientific collaboration, and a weird kind of flirtation with the ocean all pressed into an envelope. You place her samples carefully on blotting paper and whisper to yourself, tomorrow I'll make a new page. Because seaweed albums aren't meant to be finished. They grow like stories, slowly, patiently, and always one wet page at a time. It's raining the next morning. Not a dramatic thunderstorm or a romantic drizzle, just the steady gray sort of rain that makes your windows fog and your plans wilt. But you smile anyway because today isn't about tide pools or treasure hunts. Today is for the other side of seaweed, collecting the part where you sit inside, wrapped in a shawl surrounded by the slow crackle of drying paper and the scent of salt. You settle into your favorite chair by the window. A gentle breeze lifts the edge of your notebook, now fatter than ever with pressed pages. You take a sip of tea, lukewarm, but that's the aesthetic, and open to your next blank sheet. The house is quiet. The rain taps against the panes like a polite house guest. You breathe in and begin arranging your specimens. Today's subject, Sargassum muticum, the one Clarissa insisted looked like ocean raisins. She wasn't wrong. You pick through the dried fronds, now stiff and papery. Their color has faded slightly from golden brown to a mellow sepia like old photographs. That's part of the charm. Seaweed, once vibrant and chaotic, becomes still in the album, controlled, composed, but never boring. You begin pressing the pieces onto the page, building a gentle arc, framing them with loops of smaller stems. You hum to yourself. Maybe it's the rain, maybe it's the rhythm, but you're in the zone now, half artist, half archivist. And for a moment you realize this quiet ritual is more than aesthetic. It's a tiny act of rebellion. In a world where women are expected to stitch birds onto handkerchiefs and nod sweetly at things they already understand, you are building a secret language out of sea plants. Historians still argue whether hobbies like this offered genuine intellectual fulfillment or were simply a prettier cage. But you know how it feels. You know what it's like to press something between pages and realize I found this. I made it into something, and no one can take it from me. You pause and consider the label. Collected on the 14th. Low tide. Breezy. Found wedged beneath a mussel shell. You scribble it down in delicate script. You consider adding a quote, something soft, something poetic. Eventually, you settle on a single word in the corner. Stillness. Because that's what this page feels like. Still, but alive. You flip back through your album and notice something you hadn't before. A thread runs through the pages, not just algae, but emotion. Joy in the bright greens. Nostalgia in the faded browns. You can remember how you felt collecting each one, whether you were alone or with Clarissa, whether it was windy, whether the water was warm or biting. Every pressed specimen is part of a map, your map. One made not of places, but of moods. You glance up as the door creaks. Your younger sister tiptoes in, curious. She's still in her nightdress, hair loose, holding a cup of cocoa. "What's that one?" she asks, peering over your shoulder. "Sea oak," you reply. "It looked like feathers when I found it. Now it just looks tired." She giggles and sits cross-legged beside you, cocoa in one hand, biscuit crumbs already forming a constellation on her sleeve. "Can I try?" she asks. You hesitate for a half-second, not because you mind, but because seaweed collecting has always been your thing. Your refuge. But then again, maybe it's time someone else discovered the magic. You nod. Just be gentle. Pretend you're tucking it into bed. She smiles and dips a fingertip into the jar. The frond she picks up is lopsided, oddly shaped curling like an old man's eyebrow. She presses it onto the page without hesitation. "It looks like it's yawning," she says. You both laugh quietly because the rain is still talking to the windows and keep working. Later, you'll label that page together. Maybe write her name in the corner. Maybe not. Either way, the moment will live there between layers of paper and salt. You realize then that the power of this hobby isn't just about plants or art or rebellion. It's about connection. To nature. To history. To one another. You hand your sister a ribbon and let her tie the album closed. She picks a red one. You don't question it. Together you watch the rain blur the world outside. You don't need to be on the shore today. You brought the ocean home. Weeks pass, and your album swells like bread in a proving drawer. It has started to develop a certain heft, the kind that earns respectful glances when you carry it into the tea parlor, neatly bundled in linen, as if it might contain ancient scriptures or a particularly well-behaved cat. Today is album day. You arrive at the sitting room and find the others already gathered, Clarissa, of course, with her smug little ribbon-tied volume, and Edith, who claims to be more into lichens these days but still shows up to seaweed socials with suspicious punctuality. You exchange nods and subtle competitive glances. Let the algae begin. You take your seat near the fireplace, the warmth slightly wilting your hem, but comforting nonetheless. One by one the albums open, pages turn, gasps, murmurs, the occasional scandalized, is that red algae next to green bold. There's a rhythm to this ritual, like a seaweed-themed waltz. You comment on the symmetry of someone's desmerestia, accept compliments for your newly pressed chondrus crispus, and try not to look too smug when Mrs. Pevensey whispers that your arrangement has the energy of a sunset. That's what you're here for. Subtle admiration, the lifeblood of every Victorian seaweed enthusiast. It wasn't always this way. When you started collecting, you were shy about your pages, unsure if fronds arranged in gentle spirals or sea grapes curled into poetry would be taken seriously. But now you know how to build a page that earns nods, how to whisper a story through algae. Someone offers you a biscuit. You take it nodding graciously and use it to cover up a damp ink smear on your lap. Another lady flips open her album to reveal a page that's pure chaos, thick clumps of fucus stuck to parchment like storm debris. You all lean in. It's awful. It's brave. You applaud. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were more about socializing or subtle subversion, because really, what could be more quietly rebellious than a room full of women, unmarried, married, widowed, gathered without a man in sight, discussing marine life like seasoned academics? You look around and see the language of sisterhood written in salt and cellulose. No one's gossiping about husbands today. No one's fretting about hemlines. Just women, ink, and the sea. Clarissa offers to trade a page. She has an extra spiral of sargassum from Cornwall. In return, you offer your last galidium, pressed so perfectly it could pass for velvet. She eyes it, weighing its elegance. The deal is sealed with a nod and a shared grin. You've built more than an album. You've built relationships frond by frond, specimen by specimen. Each swap is a handshake. Each compliment a wink. The more pages you share, the less alone you feel in your strange, soggy passion. The parlor fills with gentle conversation, the rustle of paper, the sound of pages being turned with reverence. Tea is poured. Ink blots are admired. Someone tells the story of a seaweed specimen that survived a full train ride in a hat box. Heroic. In the corner, a younger girl, perhaps no more than 13, quietly flips through your album with wide eyes. You pretend not to notice, but can't help the warmth that floods your chest. She stops on your Ulva Lactuca page and traces the edge with one careful finger. "Did you find this one yourself?" she asks. You nod. Pulled it from under a rock. It tried to escape. She smiles. "It's beautiful. That one compliment will last you a week. As the gathering winds down, you tie your album closed with your favorite ribbon, a rich burgundy satin frayed at one end. You cradle it like something sacred. Because, frankly, it is. A record of hours of thoughts of shoes ruined by tidewater and laughter echoing across empty beaches. You step out into the late afternoon light, the scent of sea salt lingering in your shawl. And you think just for a moment that the sky looks a little like seaweed, streaked with greenish cloud and gold-edged light. The others scatter in different directions, their albums tucked under arms like cherished secrets. Clarissa tips her hat and says, "Same time next month." You nod. Of course, because seaweed isn't just something you collect. It's a way of connecting quietly with people who understand that even the simplest things, pressed fronds, salty pages, side glances in a parlor, can carry more meaning than most would ever guess. Back home, you place your album on the side table like it's made of fine porcelain. The room is still no ticking clock, no whistling kettle, just the soft creak of old floorboards and your own breath. You sit down, lift the cover again, and stare at that one page, the one that got the most compliments today. The layout is simple. 2 feathery red algae curved like parentheses, cradling a single deep green ribbon of seaweed at the center. There's a tiny label underneath, inked in your steadiest hand, found beneath the west-facing rock, alone but upright. You didn't realize it when you wrote it, but the label reads like a short poem. This is more than hobby. This is art. Victorian seaweed collectors weren't just botanists in bonnets. They were designers, composers, architects of calm chaos. Seaweed has no rules. It sprawls, curls, shrivels, and yet within those unpredictable shapes, you find order. You find balance. And if you're lucky, maybe even a little praise from Mrs. Pevensey. But today you're thinking about something else, how frond arrangement could determine your reputation. You remember a scandal from last season when Edith arranged a page with red fronds overlapping blue-green ones. There was no clear focal point, no structure. Clarissa gasped. Someone claimed it made them dizzy. And yet, it was bold. Historians still argue whether the aesthetic rules that emerged in Seaweed albums were instinctive or socially conditioned. But you know there's a delicate hierarchy form, symmetry, color, harmony. A page that's too wild feels threatening. A page that's too perfect, suspiciously professional. You must strike the sweet spot between chaos and grace, just like Seaweed itself. You flip to a blank sheet and reach for today's new specimens. There's a golden strand still curled in its jar, a deep green loop that looks like a dancer mid-spin, and a bit of red fuzz that smells assertive. You wrinkle your nose but press it anyway. The paper drinks the water slowly, leaving a ring around the frond. You pat it gently and begin the dance, arrange, rearrange, reconsider, realign. It's like playing chess with kelp. The way one strand curves to echo the next, how the colors speak across the page, these decisions matter more than you'd ever admit. Your fingers move slowly, purposefully. This is the part where time slips sideways. You could be here for 5 minutes or 50. The rain outside has stopped, but you haven't noticed. You add a border of fine red threads, then pause. Something's missing. Ah, the label. You write unruly, but holding form. May displease the committee. You grin. There's something subversive in that small act of honesty. You already know it'll provoke Clarissa, and probably win you a secret nod from Edith. That's the strange game of Victorian album-making: impress everyone, but appear not to care. If they think you tried too hard, you lose elegance. If they think you didn't try at all, you lose credibility. But if you land just right effort hidden behind grace, you win. You remember the time Beatrice glued a tiny seashell to her page as a frame for a single sprig of green algae. Half the room swooned. The other half whispered about rule-breaking. Beatrice didn't mind. She just kept gluing. She has 4 albums now. You've only filled 1. But each page you create, you realize isn't just about the plant. It's a snapshot of you at the moment you pressed it. What you were thinking, feeling, avoiding, hoping. Every frond is a fossil of a mood. You think back to that strange little red algae you found last week, curled like a question mark. You'd arranged it on a page with a swirl of brown. And now looking at it, you realize it says something. Not in words, but in posture. Like it's reaching. Or returning. Or waiting for someone to finish a sentence. You close the album fingers resting on the cloth cover. The room is quiet again. And you sit there not as a Victorian woman, not even as a seaweed collector, but as someone who in her own quiet way is building a language out of leaves and salt. And every page you complete brings you closer to saying something the world hasn't heard yet. A few days later, a brown paper parcel arrives tied with blue string and smelling faintly of lavender and mildew, the unofficial scent of long-distance correspondence between seaweed collectors. You recognize the handwriting immediately, Beatrice. Her scrawl slopes upwards like it's trying to escape the page. Inside the parcel you find 3 things: a short letter, 3 sheets of delicately pressed seaweed specimens, and a loose drawing of what appears to be a sea otter attempting yoga. Classic Beatrice. The letter is short but warm. Found these during my last outing to Rosilli Bay. Absolutely brutal wind, but the tide was kind. Enclosed 1 spiraling red, 1 leafy brown, and 1 bit that looks like a drowned goose feather. Use them well. Love B. You lay the specimens out on the table, still protected in waxed paper. 1 is vibrant, like someone melted cranberry jelly and flattened it with divine intent. The other 2 are more subtle, muted browns with frilly edges and a surprising bounce to their texture, even dry. You exhale long and slow. These are perfect. And so the ritual begins anew. You fill a basin with fresh water and soak each specimen, watching as they stretch and expand, regaining their underwater elegance. This is the part that always feels a little like resurrection, bringing dried things back to something like life. As you gently transfer the red piece onto your paper, it curls at the tip as if waving hello, or resisting captivity. It's at this point you realize you've started giving them personalities. The frond that won't lie flat is a diva. The one that tore in half while drying, definitely melancholic. The stubby one from last week that looks like a broom, probably secretly brilliant, just misunderstood. Clarissa once claimed that assigning seaweed human traits was a sign of cabin fever. But Clarissa also named her cat Admiral Brinefluff, so her authority is frankly compromised. Still you smile. Because the truth is, it's hard not to anthropomorphize seaweed. The more you collect, the more you see them not as objects, but as characters. Each frond tells a slightly different story, shaped by weather waves, luck, and rot. Historians still argue whether Victorian women used seaweed albums as coded diaries, expressing emotion through plant arrangement the way one might choose songs for a secret mixtape. There's no solid proof, but you like the theory. Because today, as you press Beatrice's crimson spiral onto a fresh page, you can't help feeling like you're sending a message back. You label it From B, storm-tossed, but still dancing. Later that evening, you light a lamp and flip back through old pages. The transformation is remarkable. What began as simple collecting has become curation. There are motifs now, progressions, pages that hum with balance and contrast, and others that scream rebellion in the quietest way. One page in particular stops you a spread of muted greens, arranged like footsteps across the paper. You remember that day vividly. It rained. You fought with your sister. You slipped on a rock and nearly lost your bonnet. And yet somehow that chaos turned into a soothing arrangement of calm tones and steady rhythm. You wrote no journal that day. But this page, this arrangement, is the record. The mood, the memory. You realize then this hobby is no longer about what you collect. It's about why. You collect to observe, to create, to express, to understand yourself by way of tangled weeds and tidal drift. You collect to leave behind a breadcrumb trail pressed in paper soaked in salt for someone someday to follow. The candle flickers. A breeze rustles the pages. You press Beatrice's last sample, a lace-like brown frond, into its place. You press the blotting paper stack, the books atop it, and say aloud to no one, "I hope I'll remember this evening." And you will, because now it's part of the album. The next week brings something unexpected. You're out for your usual shoreline ramble boots, sinking just enough in the damp sand to make that satisfying muffled shh noise when you spot her. Not a seaweed, but a woman. Standing alone near the rock's skirt, pinned awkwardly above her ankles, squinting at the water like it's challenging her to a duel. She's clearly not from around here. Her boots are city clean, her shawl is too fine for wind, and her seaweed collecting jar still has the price tag on it. A newcomer. You watch her from a distance for a moment, curious. She tiptoes toward a puddle, slips, slightly rights herself, and then determinedly plunges her hand into the shallow water. She emerges holding a clump of soggy eelgrass and a mussel shell. She looks triumphant. You walk over. You might want to shake that first, you say gently. She turns, startled, and laughs. It's my first time. Is it obvious? You grin and nod. Just slightly. Her name is Margaret, she says. New to the coast. Heard about this peculiar little trend from a cousin who swears it's therapeutic. Thought she'd try it before she forms an opinion. She says this with the kind of half-apology that women often use when admitting they've taken up something whimsical. You recognize the look. It's the same one you wore your first week out. Hopeful, skeptical, deeply uncertain, whether this strange, shore-bound ballet of puddle staring and algae hunting could possibly lead to something meaningful. You offer her a few tips, how to rinse sand off gently using wave crests, how to spot the difference between ulva and sea lettuce, spoiler none, and most importantly, how not to step into a crab hole while distracted. She's a quick learner. And just like that, the day becomes one of those rare, quiet collaborations. Two women pockets full of damp sea things, exchanging laughter and silence like currency. By midday, she's got a modest collection in her jar, nothing fancy but promising. You part ways with a nod and a soft see you again, knowing that if she's caught the bug, she'll be back. Historians still argue whether the rise in seaweed collecting clubs signaled a shift in women's intellectual agency, or simply another genteel pastime sanctioned by Victorian decorum. But standing there watching Margaret squint at a bit of wet string, like it might contain ancient truths, you're inclined to believe it was the former. Back home, you jot her name in your notebook next to a small pressed sample you'd found that morning. Just a green wisp with a bit of copper glint. Nothing remarkable. But it now carries the memory of a shared grin, a misstep in the mud, and the first spark of new friendship. You label it found while teaching. Carried on a laugh. Later that evening, you sit by the window with your album. The candlelight catches the edges of the dried fronds, casting strange shadows across the pages. You trace a finger down the spine of the book and wonder how many stories are pressed between these pages, invisible to anyone but me. And then a thought drifts through you, like mist. Perhaps that's the point. Seaweed collecting isn't loud. It isn't grand. It doesn't announce itself with oil paint or symphonies or brick monuments. It whispers in labels, in quiet arrangement, in shared glances and salt-damp pages. And yet despite its softness, it endures. Because sometimes gentle things leave the deepest impressions. The tide is especially low today, exposing parts of the shore usually hidden like secrets under the sea's hem. You head out early, basket swinging from your elbow bonnet, tied firmly, determined to reach the hidden cove before the others claim its treasures. It's not that you're competitive, it's just, well, yes, you are. Just a little. The path is damp and sea-slick, the stones spongy beneath your boots. The air carries that particular scent of brine and something ancient like Neptune's laundry left out too long. You inhale it like perfume. The cove opens before you like a secret garden. Pools glitter in the morning light, each one a miniature world crab dramas, snail pilgrimages, and of course the seaweed. Oh, the seaweed waving lazily in tidal eddies like it's greeting you with sleepy algae arms. You're alone, and it's glorious. You squat beside a pool and spot it immediately. A stunning frond of Deliceria sanguinea, deep red, delicate as lace, and curled into itself like a secret waiting to be unwrapped. You reach in carefully, both reverent and thrilled like a child about to steal a biscuit before supper. It slips free from the rock with minimal protest. You hold it up to the light, delicate veins running like an underwater map, and just for a moment it looks like it's glowing. You whisper, "Perfect," because somehow that seems polite. This one deserves its own page. You rinse it gently in the sea, then place it between layers of damp blotting paper, folding your journal around it like a hug. Later, you'll press it properly, but for now it rides home nestled beside bits of moss and one small shell that looks suspiciously like a teacup. Historians still argue whether Victorian seaweed collectors saw themselves as scientists, artists, or documentarians. But here alone in the cove, it's clear that you are a bit of all three: an explorer, mapping the wet unknown, a poet translating leaf into layout, and a dreamer who simply believes some plants deserve to be remembered. Back at your writing desk, you prepare the press. Each step has become part of your body's memory. Soak the frond in fresh water. Let it spread naturally in the basin. Watch it float like a dancer suspended mid-twirl. Then the lift, delicate, precise, and the moment it touches the page, you guide it, never force it, allowing it to choose its final pose. This one arranges itself like a cathedral window, arched and radiant. You add a single strand of green to the side, then stop. No more. Perfection needs space to breathe. For the label you write, "Found alone but glowing." Later that night, you can't sleep. You make tea. You pace. You end up back at your album flipping to that new page even though the press hasn't dried. You peek. It's curling at the edge. You smooth it with your finger and whisper, "Stay." You think about the cove, about how few people had ever stood where you stood that morning, about how many things live and die beneath the tide without ever being seen. And you realize this too is why you collect: to witness, to see what others overlook, to say this existed. It mattered, even if only to me. You close the album and return to bed, the scent of salt still clinging to your fingers. You sleep deeply and dream of red lace swirling in endless water. The morning brings a soft drizzle and a sky the color of wet linen, perfect weather for staying in and letting your fingers do the wandering through pages instead of puddles. Your album lies open, its spine gently warped from so much love, and the faint tang of dried sea still lingers in the air, as if your room itself has absorbed the shoreline. You leaf through slowly, deliberately. Each page is a memory, a tide pool in time. There's the wild frond you collected during last summer's thunderstorm. It still bears the faint imprint of the blotter paper, like it refused to be tamed even on land. Next to it, a delicate string of Cordaria flagelliformis, barely clinging to the page like a whisper someone left behind. And there, yes, that page, the one from the day Margaret first joined you. Her early specimens lie a bit crooked, a bit overlapped, but there's an unmistakable joy in the arrangement. She labeled it, "The Day I Got Soaked and Smiled Anyway." You laugh softly. She's getting better. Her pages show increasing grace. You'd never say it aloud, of course. That would ruin everything. And yet these albums, they're not just yours anymore. They're slowly becoming communal, like a stitched-together quilt of tide walks and soft friendships. Sometimes Clarissa will send you a new frond she found in North Devon. Other times, Beatrice will send a drawing of a particularly flirtatious strand of kelp. You always pretend to be annoyed, but you keep every drawing. You even started a second album one, just for collaborations. Historians still argue whether Victorian women's seaweed albums qualify as real art or simply domestic handicraft. But the debate itself feels small compared to the experience, the joy of creation, without an audience of beauty for its own sake. That's what this whole quiet world offers: unnoticed elegance. A reminder that value doesn't require validation. Later that day, You receive a small box by post. Inside is something entirely unexpected. A seaweed specimen, yes, but it's framed. Properly framed. Mounted behind glass with a small handwritten card that reads, "To the one who showed me the wonder of fronds, love, Margaret." You set it on your writing desk. It leans slightly to the left. The seaweed is arranged in a spiral resembling a curled fern or an ammonite fossil. It's bold, strange, a little crooked. Perfectly, Margaret. You think about how far you've come from that first damp walk on the beach, unsure of what you were doing, to this quiet moment of reflection, surrounded by pages and pages of pressed memory. And still, the most curious part, you never intended for it to go this far. You were just looking for something to do, something gentle, something yours. And now it's become a language, a lifeline, a connection to nature, to others, to yourself. You turn back to your album and gently close the cover. On the spine, someone has written in faded ink algae and other soft-spoken wonders. You didn't write that. Beatrice did. Without asking. Of course, but she wasn't wrong. Because pressed between these pages is something far greater than seaweed. It's the quiet unfolding of who you are. You're up early today, not from obligation, but anticipation. The tide is at its lowest in weeks, and there's talk in town of a rare bloom near the old wharf. Normally you'd scoff at such rumors. They're often just code for someone found a colorful rock, but something about this one sticks with you. Maybe it's the weather. Maybe it's the tea. Maybe it's the sense that this chapter of your seaweed collecting life deserves a poetic ending. So you pack your basket. Blotting papers, check. Tweezers, check. Biscuits, double check. The walk is quiet and oddly warm for the season. Fog curls gently around the lampposts as you pass, giving the morning a dreamlike haze as if you're moving through someone else's memory. You arrive at the wharf to find absolutely no one. Not a soul. Just wet stones, bobbing gulls, and that familiar salty hush. You breathe it in. The water shimmers. And there in the shallows, you spot it. A ribbon of seaweed you've never seen before, twisting shades of violet and indigo like a painter left their palette too long in the rain. It drifts lazily with the tide, as if inviting you to join its waltz. You step carefully, boots sliding on slick stones, until you're close enough to scoop it gently into your jar. It coils immediately, shy but intact. You grin like a child who just won a game no one else was playing. Back home, you prepare it for pressing. Soak, swirl, lift. It unfolds itself like a secret. The fronds stretch into a perfect spiral, almost too symmetrical to be believed. You decide to make this page your last in the main album, not because you're finished, but because this one feels like a full stop at the end of a long, meandering sentence. You add a small note beneath the specimen, the final frond. Found when I wasn't looking. You sit back, tea in hand, and leaf through the full album once more. Page after page of quiet discovery. Muddy boots, dripping gloves, shared giggles, salt in your tea. The scent of paper and the endless patience it requires to coax wet things into still beauty. Historians still argue whether seaweed albums were about science or sentiment taxonomy or self-expression. But for you, the answer is far simpler. They were about presence. About the gentle noticing of things most people walk past. And that perhaps is what makes seaweed art more than just a Victorian hobby. It's a meditation, a whisper, a kind of love letter to the everyday wonder most never pause long enough to see. You close the book slowly, carefully, reverently. It is complete. And now, the candle burns low now, casting golden halos on the wall. Outside, the waves murmur against the shore, soft and persistent, like a lullaby meant only for you. You sit in the stillness, wrapped in warmth. and allow the gentle rhythm of the sea to settle into your breath. The scent of the ocean, faint but lingering, reminds you of early mornings and quiet discoveries of fronds tangled like dreams, and the soothing repetition of arranging, pressing, waiting. Let your eyes grow heavy now as the flicker of your thoughts begins to dim. The album is closed, the pages are still, but their stories live on in the way you walk a little slower now by the shore, in how you notice the smallest shift in tide or light. You've made something beautiful from things the sea let go. And now it's time to let go too. Let go of the day's noise. Let go of the waves of thought. Let go like a ribbon of seaweed drifting quietly beneath a silver moon. Sink softly into your pillow like sand settling after the tide. You are safe, you are still, you are enough. Good night.